One of the pressing issues of the day, an issue that won't go away, even though from time to time there is a little light in the darkness, is HIV and AIDS. It has been called a pandemic, which it is. It's sweeping the world. Mankind has never faced anything like it in history. It's wiping out a whole generation of young adults around the world, with its epicenter right now, at least statistically, being in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. Well, right there in the middle of it all is a marvelous organization called Hands at Work, founded by George Snyman, a ministry that I have known from its inception. And George is with us today, and I'm just thrilled to have you, George. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've been on the road for a few weeks. How you doing?
It's been tough.
You look a little tired, and rightly so, rightly so. George, it was actually about 11 years ago that we met. You were just starting Hands at Work. I was just starting Vision Led. We both had dreams. We didn't have a lot on the ground as yet. And yet I had a sense, and I think you did too, that we would probably be connected significantly in the future, which is exactly what's happened. We're strategic partners. We work together. And thanks to your foot soldiers on the ground with great effect. As you look at the HIV/AIDS pandemic over the last 11 years and at your ministry, Hands at Work, how has the issue and how has the ministry changed?
Yeah, you know, if I think back, Jim, when we did meet 11 years ago, I think it was in Johannesburg one night, and a common friend, DJ, introduced us to each other. And that was the beginning of a very strategic relationship, which has been growing through the last decade. But when we met, I was completely overwhelmed with how many people were dying. And I think it's important that we look back at AIDS and we realize that it's actually got different faces. You know, and the first phase was really what they would call the invisible wave, where millions of people just got infected and nobody knew about it. And then, of course, the second wave was when people just started dying. And we actually met in the second wave. And Carolyn, my wife, and myself were just every day involved in literally praying for people, washing them, and burying them. And I can remember when we had a chat at night, how overwhelmed I felt. And there was no medication, there was no ARV or anything like that. But since then, what happened and what really needs to be known by the world is that, of course, there was an amazing effort from first world countries to bring medication to Africa. But that didn't stop the third wave. And the third wave is known as the orphan wave. And to put that into context, or to try to, just in a very brief way, would be that at the moment there are 180,000 new orphans every month. And so now we are dealing with that. But Jim, I think what happened, and the part that we need to speak about, was when ARV came in and people could stay alive for longer, there was a perception in the first world that the problem's been dealt with. But it hasn't. Just a small part of it has been attended to. But we are dealing with a sea of children just flooding Africa at the moment, and child-headed households, nobody else caring for them. And that's where we're at now with the AIDS pandemic.
Well, back on World AIDS Day, December 1, 2010, there was a report out from UNICEF that the mother-to-child transmission rates were going down, not significantly, but going down. And I have no doubt they are, because when antiretrovirals or ARV medication becomes available to that segment, there is a definite reduction. But to me, it gave us kind of a false sense of hope, that HIV and AIDS was now being dealt with. There was also a report out a few weeks previous to that about some medication being discovered that was helping to keep HIV and AIDS at bay, in terms of the same-sex community. And yet, these are little glimmers of hope in a very, very dark place. What's your experience on the ground? I know it's impossible even to know how many people live in an area. Nobody's taking censi, I guess, in most parts of Africa. But Have you any way of gauging the success of your work? I know that you work very closely with the community leaders. You're very much focused on everything from home-based care to other larger projects, many of which we're partnering with you in. But are you seeing any impact that is sustainable in your experience?
I think what's very important here to talk about, and it's not a very popular topic, particularly after we had a huge conference of Millennium Development Goals just, I think, about a month ago, where we showed a lot of success in eradicating poverty and talking about that. But Jim, here's the issue. The bottom billion, and that is the bottom billion people in the world that earn less than $1 a day, they are free falling. They are growing poorer by the hour now. And so Hands at Work is specifically targeting what we would call dysfunctional communities. Communities that do not have clinics. They do not have any infrastructure and any access. So when you talk about any country, Zambia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, wherever, you've got millions of people living under $1 a day in communities that will never have access. So I guess my answer to this would be there's a lot of progress made in communities, as we would call it, that are on the ladder already. That means they've got choices today. The children can choose. Do I want to go to school? Do I want to stay at home? But the communities in Africa that are dysfunctional or off the ladder, who've got no choices today, there's no impact there. That for me is, we've got to go back, and I think UNICEF spoke about that a little bit in the last months or so, the importance of you've got to go down to the bottom and start building up. But that's expensive and it takes time. It's hard work to go to those communities. So it's much easier to hit communities that are poor, but they're on the ladder. And for a little investment, you'll get a big return. We are crying and saying, guys, you're cutting the cord here. If you start here, you're only going to go up from here. You're never going to go lower again. So we're crying out and say, let's go down to the bottom and get to the
poorest of the poor.
Poorest of the poor.
Poorest of the poor. You know, I have real concerns about India. I was just there a few months back, and they're pretty much living in denial of the impact of HIV and AIDS and the growing numbers of orphans and widows. But when you've got a population of well over 1 billion, you can easily kind of lose touch with the poorest of the poor. But it seems to me that it's going to be a revelation one day when we discover just exactly what's happening in that subcontinent. Getting back to Africa, what do you think is your biggest challenge right now as you begin to focus on the poorest of the poor and dysfunctional communities? What's the toughest slog for you?
Let me start on a positive note on that and to say that the amazing thing that's busy happening is that African church leaders are actually becoming very excited to mobilize the poorest of the poor because they see such community transformation. So we've got now a base of African leaders that are saying, we've got the biblical mandate, we've got the passion, we're going to do that. We're saying to them, if you go in, we're going to back you, and we believe that the body of Christ outside Africa will be there all the way with you. Of course in servanthood, of course in humbleness, but also providing the physical resources that's needed. Too many girls are putting their bodies on the line for a plate of food. My biggest challenge, Jim, believe it or not, is really two things. We need volunteers from outside that are prepared to take the hands of these champions in Africa and to come in as servants and to support them with their skills, strategic thinking skills, negotiating skills, and so on. And the second thing is we desperately need people in an age where consumerism is just absolutely taken over. We need people to stop and to say, what can I as an individual do to make a difference?
Yeah. We had a pastors' conference back in April, as you know, in the Kabwe area, and,
yes.
and your people were there
yeah.
in full strength, and with a lot of the volunteers that they are leading. And I think we had about 5,000 there in Kitwe and Kabwe over the course of 3 days. and I commented later to some who asked me about this, quite impressed with the number that showed up. I said, well, I remember 4 years ago, 5 years ago, whenever we had our first meeting of pastors there, we met for a half a day, and there were 30 guys, and there wasn't a lot of interest. But as you say, and I see this as a work of the Spirit. I believe that God is speaking to His church, because the number one entity in Africa today, in my view, and I think yours too, in terms of sustainability, capacity, and long-term presence, is the local church, right?
Absolutely.
And if we can work in partnership with the local church and leverage all of this vision through local church participation with all of the volunteers that local churches can generate. I mean, there's no volunteer raising organization like a church. I see a lot of hope. But without hands at work, doing what you're doing, I don't know if we, with Vision Led, ever would have reached the point we have at this point. Shifting ground a little bit, I remember several years ago with Richard Brown, who had just begun working with me at that time, visiting you in your home at that time on the ASM, Africa School of Missions campus in northern South Africa. And your wife, Carolyn, while we were there, came in with a stricken look on her face, holding a very, very sick little girl. And both Richard and I could hardly bear it. And I remember we both had to walk out of your house for a bit. Richard went one way, I went the other, just to gather ourselves, because she was obviously dying. And you and Carolyn chose to adopt that little gal. Tell us the story. How is she? What's happened?
I spoke a little bit to Richard about it this morning. When we took her in, she was 10 months old, and Dr. Hartman, who worked across the road, said to us she was not going to live for long. And we said, well, she must stay in our house and just being loved by everyone until it's her time to go. But as you know, she refused to die. She, in fact, the pediatrician that gave us a complete clean bill of health 18 months later said to us, he didn't know us, he said to us, he cannot charge us a cent because his child was healed by love. And I remember there was a stage, I buried her mother, I buried her father, I buried her brothers. And there was a stage, I remember my one daughter, Samantha, was holding Nikiwe, and she was covered in sores. And she held Nikiwe and she lifted up and she kissed her all over. And I said to Sammy, Sammy, we must love this girl as much as we can. But you can't just kiss her on open sores like that. And she looked at me like this and she said to me, you don't have to kiss her. And she just carried on kissing her. And well, today she's our daughter. Her name is Nikiwe Grace. It means I was given grace. And next month she's turning 10 years old, and she's my sweetheart, and she's Grace.
She's a total delight. I mean, the last time I saw her, she's full of life and beautiful.
Yes.
Healed by love, huh?
Yeah.
That's how the doctor put it.
The doctor said to us officially, he said to my wife, he said, I cannot ask you for money because this child was healed by love.
I hate to be a theologian, but the scripture tells us that God is love.
Yes.
I think she was healed by God.
Yes.
As you were His hands and feet to her. See, this is the thing that impresses me about you, George. You have a great vision, and you've got a lot of courage and guts. You stick to it. You got that strong Afrikaner core in you that just won't give up. You're stubborn, but you also practice what you preach. And Nikiwe is just a case in point, but I've seen it in so many other ways. What about the people who are coming from outside, as you say? There's issues in Africa about people who come from outside, right?
Yeah.
How do you engage people from outside in a productive, proactive way with as little as possible of the colonialist or, I'm an American, I'm a European, I know everything and I'm here to help you issue?
Of course, that's a challenge. And of course, once you've made a big mistake, people remind you of that, and they will remind your children, and they will remind their children, because there are always people that want to remind you when you've done something wrong. And I think, first of all, if you look at Lausanne conference that was in Cape Town recently, there was an African delegation giving a standing ovation to the First World for reminding them and thanking them that they did bring the gospel.
Right.
So when we look back, let us just remember that the guys that came laid their lives down.
Yeah.
Did they do it wrong? Yes. No, none of us can do it right the first time. We've got to look back and say, okay, so what was wrong? And we all know now it's servanthood. We all know now Christ came as a servant to this world. Should people stay out of Africa? Absolutely not. It would be detrimental for us. Do we need people? Absolutely. As servants. Now here's the thing. I have struggled for years. When I saw the suffering in Africa, and I saw us dying off physically. You know, the average life expectancy in Swaziland is now 37. And when I saw the First World, we are losing about 26,000 children a day. I think you lose about the same number of children spiritually a day. And when I looked at this, and I remember when they came together, those two worlds collided the first time. Jim, I saw that John 10:10 that said, I've come to bring life and life in abundance. I saw that going both ways. I saw that First World person walking out there, and you know very well what I'm talking about, saying, I am the poor person here. I am poor. I need Christ. When they saw raw faith, and of course the African side get blessed and encouraged when people come to them and support them and help them. So what we say in Hands is come together. But there's a culture higher than Africa. There's a culture higher than Canadian. It's called the kingdom culture. It's called regarding others higher. So in Hands at Work, we create a platform where we take the very best out of Canada. And I'm telling you, Canada is amazing when it comes to volunteers. They send the people to us, and we create a platform where they can learn how to be servants. They can learn what it means to have faith. And they can bring their skill and their passion and have a huge influence and leave their fingerprint in places where there's no hope. Now, of course, it will be messy somewhere in between. But the end result is life and life in abundance to both sides.
Just a couple of minutes left, George. You've been at this 11 years. How has this impacted you personally? How is the George Snyman I met 11 years ago not the George Snyman I'm talking to today?
When you met me, I was shaken to my foundations as an Afrikaner who just discovered what was happening. I tasted huge success in a sense without looking for it. And I nearly had to go through a 360. I had to experience that. I had to experience the places of influence and things like that. And I had to be broken again. And I had to experience the pain at a new level. And I was recently in Goma, and I stood in a church that's been shot to pieces with women, and the blood was literally still on the floor in the church of their sons and their husbands. And my throat closed, and I became a boy 3 years, and I wanted to run home. I didn't want to be there. It was too big for me. And I saw the pain in those widows. And I realized that I'm still a baby. And it's by grace that I can have a minute little fingerprint impact. But today I can say, if it is a huge international organization, or it's me and Carolyn back in a village, by God's grace, we'll spend our lives serving these amazing people.
Yeah. You have a website?
Handsatwork.org.
Handsatwork.org. That's pretty straightforward. George Snyman, thanks for coming our way.